January 17, 1940, Dayton, Ohio. Clouded winter sky pressing down on a factory district where men in shirt sleeves walked between buildings, their breath visible in the cold. No bombers darkened these skies. No one in that moment could have foreseen that this industrial heartland would become the proving ground for a doctrine that would reshape warfare itself. General Henry Hap Arnold stood in a command office, studying maps and requisition orders with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something others could not. He was envisioning an air force that did not yet exist, one that would grow from 2,546 aircraft in 1940 to 80,000. By 1944, a revolution in how nations would wage war was being sketched in pencil and ambition. This is the story of that revolution of classified briefings that would reshape strategy, of decisions made in war rooms that would echo across the Pacific and above the German heartland, and of how one man's belief in the power of precision and overwhelming industrial might would turn the tide of his story. Be the summer of 1941. Arnold had tasked his Air War Plans Division with an impossible assignment: predict what it would take to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan through air power alone. The planners had 9 days. In that compressed moment of intellectual urgency, Hal George and his team created a WPD-1, a strategic blueprint so audacious it seemed to border on fantasy. The plan identified 150 for targets across German territory. It calculated production requirements. It predicted that if sustained for 6 months of bombardment beginning in July 1943, continuous assault on Germany's electrical grid, transportation systems, oil refineries, and aircraft factories could collapse the Nazi war machine without invasion. Secretary of War Henry Stimson listened to their presentation in his office and said simply, "General Marshall and I like the plan." Arnold had achieved something unprecedented. For the first time in military history, air power itself, not ground forces, not naval fleets, was positioned as the primary instrument of strategic defeat, but vision alone wins no wars. In the classified briefing rooms of 1943, as Operation Point Blank was being formalized at the Casablanca Conference, Arnold faced a hard truth: precision bombing doctrine, developed in peacetime by the Air Corps Tactical School, had never been tested in actual combat against an enemy with fighters, anti-aircraft batteries, and the will to defend their homeland. The combined bomber offensive that emerged from Casablanca established a hierarchy of targets that read like an engineer's anatomy of industrial war. First, submarine construction yards. Second, the aircraft industry. Third, ball bearings. Fourth, oil. Fifth, synthetic rubber. Sixth, transport vehicles. Each target was chosen because each was a bottleneck break one, and the entire German war machine would begin to grind to a halt. August 17th, 1943, a date burned into the memory of every bomber pilot who participated in what became known as the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. On that morning, 180 for B-17 flying fortresses climbed into the skies over England, their bellies loaded with ordnance, their navigators clutching maps to one of the most strategically vital cities in the German Reich. Schweinfurt produced 34% of Nazi Germany's ball bearings, tiny, seemingly insignificant metal spheres without which tanks could not turn, aircraft could not fly, and submarines could not maneuver. The raid that day destroyed approximately 1/3 of that capacity. Germans expected American bombers to be vulnerable during daylight raids. They were right. Fighters swarmed the formations. Anti-aircraft batteries filled the sky with black clouds of flak. The bombers came home damaged, bent, trailing smoke. Some did not come home at all. But the Americans had struck a blow, and in that moment, something shifted in Arnold's strategic consciousness. Precision bombing worked. The mathematics had been validated in blood and fire. 12 months later came October 14th, 1943, a day the bomber crews called Black Thursday. This time, 291 B-17s and 60 B-24s launched toward Schweinfurt. The raid would be more accurate, more devastating. Arnold had learned from failure. Curtis LeMay, a young colonel with cold eyes and an obsession with perfection, had identified the best bombardiers in his unit and made them lead bombardiers. When the lead bombardier released his bombs, the entire formation released theirs. Formation flying was tightened into what Lemmy called the combat box, a configuration that maximized the defensive firepower of the B-17's gun turrets. The doctrine of precision bombing, refined through experience, was being weaponized in that October day. 77 American bombers fell from the sky. More than 770 American airmen were killed or captured. The strategic payoff: the destruction of 67% of Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production capacity. German armaments minister Albert Speer later admitted that the bombing had devastated German industry. Plants receiving ball bearings sent men with knapsacks each day to collect whatever bearings were available and picking them like gold dust. The system was fragmenting under precision strikes, yet the human cost gnawed at Arnold. The mathematics of total war demanded sacrifice. Bombing accuracy remained imprecise by any rational measure. In 1943, the average circular error, the distance from where a bomb was aimed and where it actually fell, was 1,200 feet. This meant that of all the bombs dropped, only 16% fell within 1,000 feet of their target. A 500-pound bomb had a lethal radius of only 60 to 90 feet. It took 220 bombers dropping ordnance simultaneously to achieve a 90% probability of destroying a single target. The mathematics of industrial slaughter were becoming clarified with each mission in 1944. Curtis Lemmy's obsession with precision drilling through imprecision bore fruit. By year's end, the 8th Air Force had achieved 31.8% accuracy from an average altitude of 21,000 feet, nearly double the 1943 rate. The doctrine was working. But in the Pacific theater, a different story was unfolding, and it would force Arnold to confront whether precision itself, that sacred principle underlying all his strategic thinking, was enough. Boeing B-29 Superfortress was the culmination of Arnold's technological vision. When the first B-29 bombers reached forward bases in China in the summer of 1944, they represented the cutting edge of American engineering. Pressurized cabins allowing crews to breathe at altitudes above 30,000 feet, turbo-supercharged engines, computerized gun turrets, a flying fortress that could operate in an altitude sanctuary beyond the reach of conventional defenses. Arnold had ensured, through direct intervention, that B-29s would be used first against Japan, not as tactical support for MacArthur or Nimitz, but as the main instrument of a strategic bombing campaign under centralized command. First raid came June 5, 1940 for Operation Matterhorn, striking railroad facilities in Thailand. Then June 15th, the first direct attack on Japanese home islands against the Kyushu Iron Works. Of 68 bombers in the strike force, 47 hit the primary target. The precision doctrine was functioning, but the results seemed minimal against the vastness of Japanese war industry. By November 1944, when Brigadier General Haywood Hansell launched the first 20th Air Force strike against Tokyo with 111 B-29s, the cracks in Arnold's strategic theory were becoming visible. Only 20 for B-29s bombed the Nakajima aircraft factory. Mechanical failures plagued the new aircraft. Winds at high altitude, a phenomenon the planners had not anticipated, with full precision deflected bombs from their trajectories. The doctrine that had been refined in the European theater seemed inadequate when applied to the Pacific, where weather patterns, aircraft reliability, and Japanese defensive adaptations created an entirely different calculus for Japanese pilots scrambling to intercept the B-29s. A psychological rupture occurred that no manual or briefing could have prepared them for. The first B-29 raid on November 24, 1940 dispatched 111 bombers toward Tokyo. Japanese fighters Ki-61 Tony interceptors, Ki-40 for fighters, Ki-80 for Frank fighters climbed desperately to meet them. The bombers were visible from the ground, vapor trails etching white lines across Tokyo's sky at 32,000 feet, and the fighters could not reach them. Lieutenant Kenji Yamada, a veteran Japanese pilot, felt his Ki-61 begin to shudder as he climbed beyond 28,000 feet. The altimeter wound upward. 28,000, 29,000. 30,000 feet. The air was so thin that engines gasped like drowning men. Control surfaces became sluggish. Cannon fire from Japanese fighters had, in previous encounters, brought American bombers down, but those bombers flew at altitudes Japanese pilots understood. Altitudes where the laws of conventional air combat applied. The B-29 existed in a realm above it. First raid resulted in only one confirmed American loss to a ramming attack, a Japanese fighter pilot trading his life for one bomber. The bombers proceeded through Japanese airspace, releasing ordnance from an altitude where defending fighters merely circled helplessly below like children watching trains pass overhead. The psychological impact registered immediately in Japanese military communications. Pilots reported feelings of shame and helplessness. One pilot, Sergeant Masasaki, achieved 31,500 feet in his stripped-down Ki-61, still 2,000 feet below effective firing range. He attempted a ramming dive. The B-29's defensive guns operated by bombardiers with calculated firing solutions cut him down. What the Japanese pilots saw in those vapor trails was not merely a military threat. It was a revelation of a fundamentally different economic system. Back in Ohio, Michigan, and California, American factories were churning out aircraft at a rate that defied comprehension. The Willow Run plant near Detroit, a single facility, produced 5,476 B-2 for Liberators in 1944 and 1945. In 1944 alone, Willow Run manufactured 92 million pounds of airframe weight, surpassing more than half of Germany's total annual aircraft production. One American factory outproduced entire nation chain. Numbers seemed hallucinatory when measured against established notions of production. In 1939, America had manufactured fewer than 3,000 aircraft total for the entire military. By 1945, the figure would reach 300,000 aircraft manufacturing, which had ranked 41st among American industries in 1939, had become first place by 1944. Every month brought new records. Every quarter brought expanded capacity. B-29 itself was a tangible expression of this abundance. The aircraft cost more than the atomic bomb that would eventually be dropped from one. Yet America was building them by the hundreds. The pressurized cabin, each one a precision-manufactured cylinder capable of maintaining breathable atmosphere at altitudes where the outside air held only a quarter of sea-level oxygen, represented not just engineering sophistication, but production confidence bordering on profligacy. Japan had no equivalent. Germany had no equivalent. The Soviet Union had nothing comparable. Japan's pilots could see this truth in the endless formations of bombers that appeared with increasing frequency across their homeland skies. In December 1944, another raid. In January 1945, another. Each one involving hundreds of heavy bombers. Each one representing not a desperate expenditure of resources, but a casual deployment of abundance. General Curtis LeMay, assuming command of the 21 Bomber Command in January 1945, would later write that he found bases with gasoline shortages and aircraft bugs that made large-scale operations impossible. His predecessor had been grinding forward with inadequate resources, meager aircraft, undertrained crews. LeMay looked at this situation with contempt and made a decision that would reshape the entire air campaign. High-altitude precision bombing was failing. When LeMay arrived in the Pacific, the B-29 fleet had achieved a 5% hit rate against targets in Japan, a catastrophic failure of doctrine. The jet streams at high-altitude winds that could reach 200 miles per hour pushed bombs miles off course. Clouds obscured targets. Mechanical failures riddled the aircraft. The strategy that Arnold had championed, refined through European experience, was proving impotent against the geography and weather of the pacifist classified briefings delivered to his command. LeMay proposed a heretical transformation. What if precision bombing was not the answer? What if the entire doctrinal framework, the assumptions that had driven American air planning since 1941, was fundamentally wrong? He proposed flying B-29s at night at low altitude, 5,000 to 9,000 feet, removing the defensive guns to increase bomb capacity. and switching from precision ordnance to incendiary weapons designed to create firestorms. Advisors had convinced him that Japan lacked effective low-altitude flak capabilities and that night fighters would be ineffective against bombers in darkness. It was a gamble, a violation of every principle that strategic bombardment doctrine had established. Curtis LeMay was proposing to abandon precision and embrace area destruction. He was proposing to deliberately target not military installations, but the wooden residential areas surrounding Japanese industrial facilities. It was the transformation from the surgeon's scalpel to the flamethrower in early March 1945. LeMay assembled his commanders for a briefing that would become legendary among bomber crews. He described stripped-down B-29s carrying magnesium bombs, white phosphorus, and napalm. He described flying in streams at 5,000 feet. He described a single night that would concentrate more destructive power on a single city than had been expended in any previous bombing campaign in human history. On March 9, 1945. Exactly 279 B-29 superfortresses took off for Tokyo. The crews knew this raid would be different, that the reduction in defensive armament meant they would be vulnerable if intercepted, that the low altitude meant anti-aircraft batteries would have clear shots, that the incendiary load meant the bombs would burn rather than explode. For the first time in the Pacific campaign, Japanese defenders had an opportunity to fight back effectively. First B-29s arrived over Tokyo at 12:15 a.m. on March 10, 1945. The night was cold. The winds were from the north. The conditions were almost perfect for what LeMay intended. The lead bombers dropped incendiary markers, creating a pattern that guided the following waves. The firebombs fell in cascades, hundreds of tons per minute, creating not individual fires, but a conflagration that consumed oxygen faster than wind could replace it. A firestorm developed a self-sustaining inferno, with updrafts so violent that they pulled debris and embers hundreds of feet into the air. Japanese anti-aircraft guns found targets in the darkness. Japanese fighters, equipped with radar, scrambled to intercept. Lieutenant Yoshio Mitsuyoshi in his Nakajima Ki-44 climbed from Matsudo Airfield and finally reached an altitude where he could engage bombers conducting level bombing runs below him. He made firing pauses. He observed hits. But there were too many bombers, and the firestorm developing below was beginning to generate its own weather downdrafts and winds that made precise flying impossible. By 3:00 a.m., the raid was complete. The bombers turned south, toward the Pacific, toward safe tide. Scope of destruction defied comprehension. In a single night, 267,171 buildings were destroyed. The firestorm consumed 16 square miles of Tokyo, an estimated 100,000 people. The exact count was impossible because many bodies were vaporized in the intense heat were killed. Over 1 million were left homeless. 14 American aircraft were lost. 96 airmen did not return. The single-night destruction surpassed the combined damage of the previous year's bombing campaign. LeMay would later describe the operation with brutal candor. The U.S. had finally stopped swatting at flies and gone after the manure pile. It was the language of complete strategic transformation. Precision bombing had been abandoned. The concept of the bottleneck target, the single point whose destruction would cripple entire industrial systems, had been replaced with area destruction designed to destroy not individual factories, but the entire physical infrastructure of enemy. City Secretary of War Henry Stimson learned of the raid without advance warning. He was, according to historical accounts, deeply shocked, not at the results but at the method. He believed Curtis LeMay had violated the boundaries of acceptable military practice. Yet he did not intervene, requesting only that specific cities like Kyoto be spared. The decision had already been made at the operational level. In the classified briefings where LeMay and Arnold had determined that precision bombing was insufficient to the task of defeating Japan in the months that followed. Incendiary raids were launched against 67 Japanese cities. The campaign destroyed an estimated 56% of Japanese urban industrial capacity through area bombardment. The precision doctrine that Arnold had championed as the foundation of strategic air theory, that bombing could be discriminating, could target military-industrial capacity while sparing civilians had been abandoned. The evidence from the Pacific was unambiguous. Precision was not achieving results fast enough for pilots and civilians. Watching their own cities burn through 1943 and 1944 understood something that the Japanese were discovering in 1945, that American air superiority was not a temporary advantage but a permanent condition rising from a fundamentally different economic system. Survivors of the Hamburg bombing in July 1943, where 18,000 to 42,000 people were killed in firestorms created by RAF incendiary attacks, described the psychological state as one of complete helplessness. The Swiss consulate in Cologne reported that civilian morale was less than zero. In Essen, 250,000 people fled the city by May 1943, camping in the woods near the town, living as refugees in their own nation. What German and Japanese populations were experiencing was not merely the destructive power of air bombardment, it was the revelation that their enemies possessed industrial capacity that could not be matched. That American aircraft production could sustain losses that would bankrupt other nations. That the mathematics of total war had shifted into a new register entirely. Aluminum strips, window, as the British called them, became a powerful symbol of this disparity. The Royal Air Force had developed a technique of dropping thin aluminum foils that confused German radar by creating false signals. For the German air defense system, this meant that no technical innovation could overcome American abundance. When Germany devised countermeasures, America had simply flooded the enemy with such overwhelming quantities of chaff that the radar operators could not distinguish real targets from false ones. The B-29 itself became the ultimate symbol. The pressurized cabin meant that crew members could breathe at altitudes where Japanese fighters could not function. The aircraft represented not merely a weapon, but a statement about industrial productivity. Every rivet, every weld, every precision manufactured component spoke to an economic system that could afford to expend resources on qualities that seemed almost luxurious. The ability to keep crews comfortable and functional at extreme altitude. Japanese pilots looked up at vapor trails streaking across Tokyo's sky at 32,000 feet. They were seeing American industrial democracy made visible, a system where competition among aircraft manufacturers had produced the Mustang, the Thunderbolt, and the Super Fortress, a system where free labor markets and profit incentives had driven engineers to solve technical problems that had defeated Nazi and Japanese centralized planning, a system where resources flowed not through bureaucratic decree, but through the market decisions of thousands of small actors working within a framework of democratic capitalism. German Luftwaffe, for all its pilot skill and bravery, was operating under an entirely different constrained structure. Gearing and the Nazi state controlled aircraft production centrally. Innovation was constrained by political decisions and resource allocation mandates. When the Germans recognized that daytime fighter defense had failed, they could not simply build long-range escort fighters. They had already attempted this with the Me-260 jet fighter. But production was limited, pilot training was inadequate, and the centralized system could not adapt fast enough to changing tactical reality. Yes, the firebombing campaign that stretched from March through August 1945 killed an estimated 500,000 Japanese civilians. This figure remains controversial among historians and moralists. Some argue that the bombing was necessary to force Japanese surrender without an invasion that would have cost millions of additional lives. Others contend that the deliberate destruction of civilian populations represents a violation of warfare's traditional boundaries that transcends military utilitarianism. Lemay would later write that if the war is shortened by a single day, the attack will have served its purpose. The statement captures the cold calculus of total war, that individual civilian deaths could be justified if measured against the alternative of military invasion and the larger casualties that would ensue. It was the mathematics of strategic bombing reduced to its essence, the exchange rate between air ordnance and human life, and the classified briefings that authorized continued incendiary raids. No one calculated the exact number of civilians being killed. The Strategic Bombing Survey, compiled after the war by an impartial board of experts, would later determine that the bombing campaign had devastated Japanese war production. But the survey also revealed something more complicated: that Japanese industry had proven far more resilient than Allied planners had expected. That dispersal and relocation of factories had mitigated bombing damage, and that the surrender of Japan in August 1945 resulted from a convergence of factors: Soviet entry into the war, American invasion preparations, and the atomic bombings. In addition to conventional bombing, Japanese military leadership had expected that American bombers, flying at high altitude without fighter escort, would suffer catastrophic losses that would force strategic bombing to be abandoned. What they experienced was the revelation that altitude itself could be conquered, that American technology had transcended the altitude barriers that Japanese fighters could not overcome, and that American industrial capacity was so vast that bomber losses simply did not matter. More aircraft would be produced, more crews trained, more raids launched. Hegemon populations had expected that their home cities were protected by distance and defense. What they experienced beginning in 1943 was the progressive destruction of industrial cities through sustained bombing campaigns that they could neither prevent nor adequately defend against. They experienced the helplessness of hiding in shelters that were full beyond capacity, the exhaustion from constant air raid sirens, the dislocation of entire families fleeing damaged cities. American strategic planners, in turn, had expected that precision bombing against bottleneck targets would force German surrender. What they discovered was that precision bombing, even when accurate, was insufficient to the destruction of an entire industrial system. The bombing campaigns had to expand in scope, shift in target selection, and eventually abandon the doctrinal principles that had guided their planning. Curtis LeMay's transformation from believer in precision bombing to architect of firebombing campaigns represented not a failure of doctrine, but its mutation under the pressure of reality. The doctrine was proven correct in principle. Bombing German ball-bearing factories did reduce German production, but incorrect in assumption about the pace and scale of destruction required in the end. Arnold's air power revolution succeeded through a mechanism that none of his peacetime planners had anticipated. Not through precision, not through bottleneck targets, but through the sheer productive capacity of a free market economy operating under democratic governance with no central authority capable of constraining resource allocation. Fascist and imperial systems that America fought had attempted to centralize all productive capacity under state direction. This allowed rapid mobilization of resources toward military ends, but it also created rigidity. When the Luftwaffe recognized that conventional fighters could not defend against high-altitude bombers, they attempted to develop jet fighters and rocket-powered interceptors. These were technical achievements of remarkable sophistication, but production remained limited, pilot training remained inadequate, and the centralized system could not adapt to new operational realities fast enough. American system worked differently. When precision bombing proved inadequate, bombing strategy transformed. When aircraft designs proved insufficient, new designs were produced. When fighter pilots faced superior Japanese aircraft in the early war, the P-51 Mustang was rapidly developed and produced in overwhelming numbers, 14,501 total, because competing manufacturers and profit incentives drove innovation. This was the true revolution in air power that Arnold pioneered. Not bombing technique or target selection, but the mobilization of an entire economic system toward military production with a flexibility and scale that centrally planned economies could not match. The B-2 for Liberator 18,000 built. The B-17 Flying Fortress 12,731 built. Aircraft that could be lost in bombing campaigns and replaced with newer, improved versions flowing from American factories at rates that seemed literally impossible to German and Japanese observers. When Japanese pilots climbed desperately toward B-29s they could not reach, they were experiencing not merely technological defeat, they were experiencing the collision between two fundamentally different systems of economic and political organization. One system distributed decision-making power across thousands of actors, engineers, managers, workers, each making choices within a framework of profit and competitive advantage. Another system concentrated decision-making in state bureaucracies, attempting to allocate resources according to political and military priorities. Air power revolution succeeded because abundance itself became a weapon, not the precision of individual bombs, but the overwhelming quantity of ordnance that could be delivered. Not the technical superiority of individual aircraft, but the capacity to replace losses with never-ending production. Not the brilliance of individual strategic plans, but the flexibility of a system that could absorb failure and adapt. Arnold had glimpsed this truth in 1941 when he tasked his planners with calculating production requirements. The AWPD-1 called for 75,000 aircraft and 2.7 million men by 1942. These figures seemed like fantasies at the time. By 1944, the reality had exceeded them. The revolution in air power was not primarily doctrinal or tactical. It was structural, an expression of a free society's capacity to translate economic freedom into military-powered lessons would echo into the Cold War and beyond. The technical specifications of aircraft, the sophistication of bombardment doctrine, the precision of targeting all mattered. But they mattered only as expressions of a deeper capacity, the ability of a free society to allocate resources towards strategic objectives, to adapt when initial strategies proved insufficient, and to maintain the technological and industrial edge that comes not from central planning but from the distributed intelligence of millions of individuals making choices within markets, driven by competition and innovation. On March 10, 1945, as the last B-29s returned from Tokyo, the firestorm still raging below them, Curtis LeMay had transformed strategic bombing theory to something Arnold's pre-war planners could not have fully anticipated. The precision doctrine had been abandoned, but the underlying truth that air power was the instrument of total victory, this remained intact. That truth rested not on perfect bombing accuracy or optimal target selection, but on the inexhaustible abundance of a free society at war, channeling its economic power toward the skies, toward the destruction of enemies, and toward the validation of a system that trusted distributed decision-making over centralized, controlled vapor trails crossing Tokyo's sky. 1945 were not merely lines of smoke and ice crystal. They were the visible expression of freedom's most terrible power, not the power to create, but the power to destroy utterly, completely, and without the constraints that bound centrally planned economies to the limitations of bureaucratic decision-making. And when the war ended, this lesson that economic freedom translates into military power, that abundance itself becomes a weapon, that innovation emerges from competition and markets rather than central planning would become the foundation upon which the Cold War would be fought, not with bombs alone, but with the silent assertion of productive capacity and technological innovation that free societies could sustain indefinitely.